Okay, Matt spoke. Thank you so much for joining me today.
Yeah, thanks for having me on, Adam.
Let's start with like the most obvious question in the world. And can you just quickly describe for us what is Project Ontario and maybe more importantly, who is Project Ontario?
Yeah, good question. Project Ontario is an initiative that we launched earlier this year, right in about June of 2025. It was a group of conservatives in the province that came together on the idea that we were disappointed, let's say, by the track record of our current sitting PC government, that we had policy ideas and agendas that were not being championed by this government, and that we wanted to start doing something about it. So I think in the context of a Queen's Park that really lacks opposition, at least an organized opposition, because the Ontario Liberal Party and NDP have just been in disarray for so long. It seems like the PC government sort of gets away with a lot without having anybody, speaking truth to power or holding them accountable. So this is a group of people. There's a couple of dozen of us behind the scenes as contributors that come from various backgrounds in business and policy and the think tanks, people that have backgrounds in government, that we pulled together to start contributing policy ideas. And ultimately, one thing led to the next, and we started organizing a little bit more of like a, political organization around, putting these ideas into the mainstream and trying to put some pressure on the sitting government.
Can you talk a bit about like sort of what specifically you find disappointing about this government? I mean, I could be flippant and go like, what's the matter, Matt? You tired of winning? Because three majority governments isn't anything to sneeze at. But hypothetically speaking,
Yeah,
despite the criticisms of Doug Ford, he wins. This party wins.
absolutely. Yeah.
We can blame the dysfunction of the opposition parties, and believe me, I have. But um, in terms of just like the specifics, what is this government doing that you don't like, and what would you rather they be doing?
But I mean, I think I'll take your point on they do keep winning, and you can give them credit for that. But also that is sort of the root of the frustration is, to win and accomplish, from our perspective, let's say quote unquote nothing. I won't pretend they have done nothing since they've been in government, but on major policy files that we can dive into, there hasn't been a huge amount of movement in a direction that I think conservatives would be excited about. After a third majority victory, you'd expect with that kind of political capital, you'd start taking some risks on policy files that are historically conservative policy files. Like I'll take education as an example. We've long talked in Ontario about the idea of introducing more choice in education, more parental responsibility in terms of how our kids are educated. We see the Minister of Education today putting more pressure on public school boards, but we have
Mm,
yet to go as far as actually encouraging or enabling parents to make choices outside of the public school boards. A system that exists very commonly in British Columbia and Alberta and Quebec. This is not a unique idea in Canada to say, hey, if parents want to homeschool their children, if they want to go to an alternative school, if they want to go to a religious school, that there should be some level of support associated to those types of decisions. This is an idea that I think has been, a core conservative idea in Ontario for decades. We're now sitting at 52% of the polls with a minister of education that complains that the school boards are not doing what they should be doing. And we're overlooking this really significant and powerful lever that we have, which would be to introduce competition into our school system. That's one
mm,
example. So I mean, to me, a lot of this sort of rolls back up to the idea of what are conservative principles? What are the ideas that ground conservatives? Loosely defined, small c conservatives. I think it's ideas like personal responsibility, like family is sort of the core ingredient in a functioning society, limited role for government in the market, in the economy. And I think on a lot of these things, we just see the government sort of tilting in the opposite direction. I mean, I look at our economic policy today tends to be very, very much a heavy-handed approach to corporate subsidies where we are picking winners and
mm.
losers. We're deciding to write multi-billion dollar checks to certain industries and certain companies, but not to other industries, not to other companies. I think that's, the complete opposite of what a conservative approach on the economy might look like. So, there are many of us in this group that come from different policy backgrounds. And so I'll say, there are people that have, a bone to pick on healthcare, on education, on early childhood education, on housing, on the economy. So there are a number of things, but it really sort of boils up to like, do we know what we believe in as a movement, and are we championing those beliefs in policy? And we just think that there's a gap there.
That's all of that's interesting. Before diving in a bit more though, I want to talk about I guess challenges to on the right to the PC party because there have been some. There have been New Blue, there have been Ontario Party, and I imagine I know what your answer is going to be, but so that we could sort of put it on the record. Those parties have not been terribly successful in terms of like splitting off that conservative support. Um, and I imagine you've looked at them too. So what are the lessons there in terms of like trying to understand, I guess trying to realign the center right in Ontario
Yeah.
and how do you, I guess, make a big enough dent in Doug Ford's base so that he can't just write you off with respect as a bunch of yahoos.
Yeah, totally. No, and we've had this debate, I mean, several times. And I'll say, I won't pretend to know the inner workings or the full stories around these other sort of like fractured political parties that started over the last few years. But my like very, very high level observation of these parties is that they were very much born at a time where there was a single issue that animated the electorate,
Mm,
typically COVID-19 restrictions and things related to that. They are parties that were very much designed around like a single personality, and they sort of feel reminiscent of like Maxime Bernier's People's Party, right? Where if
right.
it weren't Maxime Bernier, there would be no People's Party, right? Like they don't seem like they are grounded first in a set of ideas. They seem like they are grounded mostly in sort of a cult of personality to say, hey, this person felt like they were mistreated by the party, and so they went off and they started a competing party. I don't think that's the path towards like meaningful reform in Ontario. I do think Ontario, unlike other provinces, let's say in Western Canada or even in Quebec, where it's very common to see new parties being created that actually have opportunity for electoral success. As recently as the BC Conservatives performing
Right.
as well as they did in the last election,
Yeah.
obviously the CP in Alberta after the Wild Rose fracture. Like there's lots of stories like this in parts of Canada. I think Ontario very much is a progressive conservative province. I think both in our history as a government and as like electoral track record, but also in that name. I do think Ontario is by definition a progressive conservative province. I think I don't think that we are going to find the same brand of conservatism in Ontario that we will find in other parts of the country. I think reform really comes from within the party. You mentioned Doug Ford's base. I think I would challenge the premise that there is a base. I think the base
Mm,
has sort of evaporated over the last 7.5 years. I think when you look into the polling, you realize that people are voting sort of in apathy. Like they don't really feel like they
right.
have many alternatives. And so, I think there was an Abacus data poll in the last couple of weeks that said, hey, yes, the PCs are still sitting at 52% in support. But when you ask people like for, one level deeper, you realize that the strong support only sits around 25%. The other 25% is just like, I don't know where else to place my support. There's no seemingly better alternative. So this is not like a diehard passionate base that is following this leadership. And so I do think there's an opportunity to sort of like reinvent the PC party. It might take years to do that. But we've had PC parties like Bill Davis, but we've also had PC parties like Mike Harris, very different brands of conservatism within the
Right.
same premise, right? So right now we have a PC party that is very much like sort of the Ford Nation PC party. I think there will be an era where the PC party has to be redefined post Doug Ford, and we just want to be involved in sort of like creating that definition. So that's what we're.
Do you have a definition in mind? Because I mean, as you said, the Bill Davis brand and the Mike Harris brand are vastly different. Is this a maneuver where, you want to kind of have that rake out? It's like, here are the conservative principles. How do we achieve them? Or is there a particular vision in mind?
Well, I mean, I think the vision starts with, what are the lives that people want to live, and what are the things that people actually care about on a day-to-day basis. And this is another thing that I find fascinating when you look at the polling data. There was an Angus Reid data poll in September that came out and said, yes, the PCs are sitting north of 50%. But if you ask voters on specific issues, we were doing very poorly. We were doing poorly on cost of living. We're doing poorly on healthcare. We're doing poorly on education. We're doing poorly on crime and public safety. But we're doing well overall because Doug Ford is a likable guy, because he's great. He's a great retail politician, et cetera. Right. So I think if you go zoom in on these issues, people want good jobs. They want to be able to afford their homes. They want their kids to go to good schools. They want to have safe streets. Like these are not radical Yahoo right wing ideas. Right. I think getting back to just like this sense of normalcy And I think a lot of that can be achieved through conservative policy. And maybe the path from getting from where we are today to that requires some reform. But I think that normal is very possible, and I don't think it's a very I don't think it's a conservative versus liberal paradigm. I think most people would agree with those general questions. So I think that's where we would end up, is just like get back to some of these very, very normal things that Ontarians would care about.
Let me throw this at you then. Like, how much of this is a civics problem? Because I think we saw that in the provincial election in February. I've heard from fellow journalists and people who are running in the campaign or door knocking, and people were very, very angry about Justin Trudeau about things that were very, very much the provincial responsibility. And then,
Yeah.
we see it in the news, like cities are blaming the province is blaming the feds is blaming, you know, economic conditions. They're like, there's just so much passing the buck. And I think the average person on the street who's just going to work, getting their kids to school, are not necessarily aware of what the separation of powers are. And I mean, is there an ignorance factor that we have to rebuild from as well? I don't mean ignorance in a negative way, just that, people don't necessarily
No,
understand the
I
government
mean,
they're
you're
voting
absolutely
for.
right. I would say that, one of the biggest things that Doug Ford had going for him for the last, 5 or so years, let's say, since like his early days as premier, was that he could kick the can towards Justin Trudeau. I think Justin
Mm,
Trudeau was a great punching bag for the last few years that he was in office. It was very easy to pass the buck to Justin Trudeau for all issues, let alone the Bank of Canada. I mean, I think on housing as a prime example, like where it's never been the premier's fault or the Ontario government's fault. It's always been the fault of interest rates and the Bank of Canada not reducing them fast enough.
sure.
Um, I do think that there is a question of civics, but I don't think that the problem is going to be solved by further educating, voters on like whose responsibility is what. I think all levels of government have to take responsibility for the issues that are most directly affecting people. You take housing, for example. I think as recently as 3 years ago, Justin Trudeau made the comment that this was a municipal problem and the federal government didn't have a role to play in it.
Mm,
Today we've got a prime minister in Ottawa that's building a new housing agency. I can take issue with the merits of the policy, but they've recognized that they have to do something about it. They can't just simply point the finger at the municipal levels of government. I do think that the dynamic between the province and cities is more interesting, because the reality is, and I think again most people don't realize this, there is no such thing as a jurisdictional difference between the province and cities as there is between the province and the federal government. The
right.
province and the federal government, these are constitutionally defined jurisdictions. The province and cities, these are delegated responsibilities that the province has full authority to take back. If the province decides that cities are not properly administering their duties on things like housing, which is a very obvious one, they have the authority to take that power back to Queen's Park and change policy. Mike Harris did this, famously with lots of different areas of government where they sort of redivided the lines between what will be municipal and what will be provincial. We allow cities to govern the way they do, and if we disagree with the way they're governing, we are allowed to change those rules as a provincial government. I think Doug Ford has been great at sort of like skating where the story is. Right now it's all about Donald Trump. Reality is that he has very little to do with foreign trade negotiations, and frankly, often just gets in the way when there's a lot he
Mm.
could do within his own province to help improve the economy, for example, that's not related to U.S. tariffs. So, yeah, I don't buy that we need to allow politicians to stay within their lanes, because at the end of the day, I think voters just want somebody to take this problem seriously. And I think most problems, there is an aspect at almost every level of government. And it's just, it might be like all hands on deck to solve an issue.
You teed me up for something I took from a thing on the Hub that was written about Project Ontario. I think that Project Ontario contributed to in terms of like, this is who we are, this is why we're here. That the group is about free markets, responsible governments, and a government that knows its limits and obligations. And the reason why that last part stuck out to me is I hear a lot from municipal leaders, including I guess I had last week, Doug Craig, the former mayor of Cambridge, saying like we need a new deal for cities. We see so much of what's happening at the provincial government, like ripping out speed enforcement cameras and ripping out bike lanes, and we're going to consolidate conservation authorities now is another thing. In appreciating that it is all of this is within the provincial government's power to do. Um, I don't, and maybe you disagree, but these are powers of the municipality, and they can be taken away. But I mean, is that where the focus of a conservative government should be? Is like in reorganizing powers? If that's not even if that's not necessarily like, I don't think we're having problems with housing because conservation authorities are, you know, over managing the floodplains, right?
Yeah, no, I think that's right. Listen, and I'm sure there are details of some of these policy approaches that I might agree with and details that I might disagree with. But I do think that in the order of priorities, these are very low on the list, right? In terms of like what are the major issues facing the province today? Speed cameras near schools is not a major issue that is facing the province today, right? So I think the premier and the folks around him like to drift towards things that are hot topics in the moment that pull well, that get the right sort of eyeballs and clicks on the right headlines. I think they've done that very well. It tends to mean that they're never focused on the long-term core reforms that they need to be focused on. And they're always sort of like, moving on to the next hot topic of the day, whatever that might be. Right now, it happens to be speed cameras. But before that, there was, issues related to bike lanes in Toronto. I think there's lots of these things. You know, do I agree or disagree with the bike lane policy in Toronto? It's sort of irrelevant because it's just not a top priority when you think of the pecking order of things that are going wrong in, Ontario today.
Sure.
Um, I do think that the government does have to play a role in terms of setting boundaries for cities, though. And maybe speed cameras is too specific of an example, but I think if you
Mm,
start cities, running away with new revenue tools and running away with uncontrolled spending,
right.
you probably do need to go back and look at the fundamental, structure in which municipalities are allowed to operate. How are they funded? How are they allowed to manage their budgets? What are they allowed to spend money on? Because we do see cities across the province now that are just saying, hey, our budgets just don't add up. It tends to be that the first instinct is to go to the revenue side of that problem to say, hey, we need more money, versus going to the cost side of that problem to say, hey, maybe you're spending money on the wrong things or you're not spending money
Mm.
efficiently. And I think there could be more provincial involvement to make sure that we have sustainable cities. You do need cities that, and I say that in the sense of financially sustainable cities. You can't have cities that are going bankrupt that turn to the province to sort of solve their problems. But speed cameras is too specific of an example, and I think a distraction, frankly.
Right. There needs to be, and this is maybe where there needs to be that fulsome discussion, not just about like the Conservative Party in Ontario, but the management of these things. We're so busy putting out fires that we're not identifying the cause of fires, and I think that's what we're seeing with a lot of the back and forth about finances.
Well,
Is
I'll use like, development charges is a hot topic these days
sure.
across the province. Particularly, I work in housing development in Toronto. We face this every day. You look at the history of development charges. This is a revenue tool that was given to municipalities by the cities, and was effectively increasingly liberalized so that cities could increase the rate of increase on these things. If I look at development charges cynically, I look at a tax source that municipalities were able to levy in a time when the housing market was exploding, when
Mm,
everything was going up every year, year over year across the province, and that people would almost not even take notice of the fact that there was this new tax sitting inside, this housing price tag,
right.
this price tag. The reality is that cities have been too cowardly to go back and revisit their property tax base, the way they evaluate property taxes, the way
Mm,
they set property taxes, because a lot of the things that you now see cities paying for with development charges, in principle, are things we should be paying for in property taxes. Things that relate to all citizens in a city, not just new houses and new infrastructure and things like that. Naturally, that's a political problem because no mayor or city councilor wants to run on a platform that says we're going to increase your property taxes. But it's been this sort of quiet, convenient, private, secret tax that nobody noticed was there,
right.
because for the last decade you could increase the price of housing and everybody would make more money the next year. All of a sudden, that market's gone, and now
Yeah.
people start realizing, how is it that we're charging $200,000 in taxes to build a new unit of housing in Guelph or in Vaughan or in wherever, right? Now all of a sudden there's accountability that's starting to show up.
But there's a level of nuance there that I feel like the current Ontario government just doesn't want to get to, and we're running out of time. So I want to look at this from another perspective because Doug Ford is ultimately one guy, or Paul Calandra is one guy, or Todd McCarthy is one guy, and we've seen, you know, you mentioned the BC Conservatives, John. Rodstead is kind of facing dissension in the ranks. Jason Kenney was kind of tossed out of the party he helped create. Is are any awareness on your part that, there are principled conservatives inside the party right now, whether that's staff, whether that's a member of the caucus who, would like to get back to some of these like brass tacks principles and, maybe feel like they can't say anything? Like, are you
Uh,
aware of a whisper
Absolutely.
campaign?
No, there are many. I
Okay.
should say, I think the caveat to everything we're saying is that there are many good conservatives working in this government. I think the challenge is they've created a culture that doesn't allow for disagreement, that doesn't allow for, diversity of opinions. And so you sort of toe the line or you get out. And in fact, among our contributors, we have people that have worked for this government in the earlier days of this government, who left because they started disagreeing with sort of the policy agenda. You saw a lot of people disagree during the COVID period specifically, but
Mm,
even beyond that, just the way that they've been approaching other policy files. I think there are many very, very solid members of this caucus, very solid members of this cabinet. I will say in cabinet, I hold a little bit more accountability to cabinet members to just sort of like enable this agenda.
mm,
Caucus members, I think, are maybe a little bit more blameless, sitting on the sidelines to a certain extent and not really able to shift the agenda. But at some point, if you're in cabinet for, going on 10 years, and you hope that one day you're going to step into the leadership role post Doug Ford, you're going to have to answer for the decisions that were made while you were sitting around the cabinet table as well. And so, I think a lot of people join this government with good intentions, and good principles. And then you sort of get jaded by politics. You get jaded by the role of lobbyists in the provincial government. You get jaded by the premier's office sort of controlling pretty much every major decision that flows through this government. We're now again on housing because it's an area that I spend so much time focusing on. We're on our fourth housing minister since, or third or fourth housing minister since, no, third housing minister since the beginning of this government,
mm,
none of which have been able to meaningfully move their agendas forward. And as we understand it, they've all wanted to, but have been stopped by the premier's office, stopped by the campaign manager of the premier, the sort of like connected special interest around the premier. And so I do think that one day something like Project Ontario, and we hope it will be Project Ontario, will start to give enough voice to these ideas that members of caucus and cabinet will start to have enough courage to speak out, and disagree. And I think there's a natural moment coming because at some point, Doug Ford is approaching 10 years as a leader,
mm.
7.5 years or 8 years as premier. I think there will be a moment soon where people start to question I think in a very reasonable way to say, hey, maybe it's time for us to think about what happens after Doug Ford. And that'll start to create more conversation inside the party. And I will say that what we're doing as Project Ontario is not unique in other jurisdictions in the country. I mean, there is no such thing as a conservative movement organization in Ontario that is not the PC party itself. Federally,
Mm.
we have many conservative movement organizations. Provincially, in other provinces, there are conservative movement organizations. The idea that it is, controversial to start an organization that has ideas, that wants to talk about those ideas, that wants to champion those ideas, is only really controversial in Ontario because this happens everywhere else in the country. So, hopefully that starts to give some voice to some folks sitting in the ranks of this government.
Well, Matt, if people are interested in learning more, I know that there is plans in the works. There is a Project Ontario website. But if people are interested in learning more and want to get involved, let's say it's not in outside the realm of possibility, someone listening here might want to get involved. But how can they do that? How can they learn more about Project Ontario?
Well, simplest starting point is projectontario.ca. We're starting to host a series of events. We'll have a few before the end of this year and more to announce in 2026. We're diving into some more issue-specific events. We're going to be hosting an event on safe supply and drug policy related to sort of like homelessness and drugs in our cities. We're hosting an event on education reform. So you can find these things on our website, and once the details are up, you can register and participate. Some of these are going to be virtual events. Some of them will be in person. And we hope that in 2026 we'll start doing a little bit more of a regional event tour where we can start showing up in different parts of the province to connect with folks. So that's probably the best way. You can sign up for our mailing list and find out more about what we're doing on our website.
All right. Well, we'll keep an eye open, but we'll call it a day for now. But Matt Spoke, thank you so much for your time today.
Thank you, Adam.